John, who wrote this gospel, was a disciple of Jesus and a witness of the resurrection. He refers to himself in these verses and at other points in the gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Not because he was the only one of them who Jesus loved, or because he felt he was loved more than the others. It's just a phrase he chose to use instead of mentioning his own name. He was modest. But it's nice to know that the one thing John remembered about Jesus was that Jesus was one who loved him. Anyway, the thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the words we've just read are John's personal recollection of what happened on that amazing day. It's his eyewitness account, along with his memory of what Mary Magdalene said about what she saw and heard too. We don't know how long after it was that John wrote down these recollections, but there's no doubt it was a story he told verbally on many, many occasions. It would have remained very fresh in his mind. And it's fascinating to think about what in particular stood out in his mind about what had happened on that day. The first thing he remembers is that Mary came running to tell them what she'd seen, the news that the tomb was empty. He could probably remember the look on her face as she arrived to tell them this, not only out of breath from running, but at that point she was distraught and confused about what she'd found. Why was the tomb empty? Just couldn't understand it. And he remembers too that he and Peter ran back to the tomb to see for themselves. He even remembers outrunning Peter to get there. I wonder whether they joked about that afterwards, about who got to the tomb first. He made sure he recorded who got to the tomb first. It's a typical sort of man thing, isn't it, I suppose, really. But there was then another particular and vivid image that had remained in his mind, because about what he saw when he got to the tomb and looked in. And what just stunned him was the sight of the grave clothes. That's what he remembered more than anything. The sight of the grave clothes that had been wrapped around the body of Jesus. He says, anyway, that when he saw those grave clothes and how they were laid there, that he believed. There was something about the way those grave clothes lay there which convinced him, either straight away or a little time afterwards, when he thought about the implications. That convinced him that Jesus had risen from the dead. Because, not only was it just out of the question that anybody who'd taken the body anywhere would have spent time unwrapping the body. That made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But also, as John's description implies, the clothes appeared to be undisturbed, as if the body had just passed through them, and leaving them in place, and that they had just collapsed. Apparently archaeologists have found at least one first century tomb from the same area where they found the grave clothes looking just like this description, except that they had bones inside them. You can imagine the shock of somebody seeing this arrangement, nothing inside. Now, you may have noticed that the accounts of the resurrection we read in the other three Gospels are a bit different than John's. And they're all a bit different from each other, but not necessarily contradictory. They record other people's recollections of what happened. And as those who've got anything to do with, or had anything to do with eyewitness accounts of a particular incident know, they always differ. Because different people witness different parts of the action. Different people remember different bits of what they saw. People see things from different viewpoints, both physically and emotionally as well. And people interpret what they see differently. That's the nature of real eyewitness accounts. And the fact that these four accounts we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are all somewhat different, while being, of course, generally similar, just adds to their authenticity. It's what we'd expect if they were genuine accounts from different people. It also provides evidence that they've not been tampered with by someone in the meantime, since they were written. Someone who wanted to smooth out the inconsistencies. No, therefore, original accounts written by either those who were there and saw themselves, or those who talked to those who'd been there and saw for themselves. And then they've simply been collected together and kept for posterity, for you and I now to read. And of course it wasn't just the empty tomb that people witnessed. It was also the risen Jesus himself. And according to both Mark and John, Mary Magdalene, one of the followers of Jesus, was the first to see him. But one thing's quite clear as you read the account: she had no expectation whatsoever of seeing Jesus alive again. Her first words when she came back to Peter and John was, "They've taken him." That's all she could think. Somebody had taken him, although clearly not knowing who they might be. And when Jesus first appeared and spoke, she didn't even recognise him. Okay, he might have looked a little bit different at that point in his resurrected body. But instead, and rather bizarrely, Mary first thinks he's the gardener. Because the only track that her mind is taking is to find out who'd moved the body. Who'd moved the dead body of Jesus? Where was the body now? She wanted to know. But as far as her recollections were concerned of that event, the one thing she remembered so clearly afterwards was the moment he called her name out. The moment when her life changed as she did recognise who was standing there before her. That it was Jesus, alive again. And then as we read on in this gospel as well as in the other gospels, we find that many more people saw him and believed. Next it was two followers walking away from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus. And we're going to look at that account next week. Then he appeared to the disciples gathered together in a particular room. We'll look at that in 2 weeks' time. But John goes on to tell us how the first time that happened, Thomas was missing. And Jesus appeared a second time when Thomas was there. The disciples saw Jesus again after they'd returned to Galilee. Once while they were fishing, if you remember, and they then had breakfast with Jesus on the beach. Another time when he gave them what we call the Great Commission, that great instruction to go out now and make disciples of all nations. And finally they saw him again at the Ascension as he returned to heaven. We're going to look at all these accounts over the next few weeks. But it seems that the Gospels didn't in fact record all the appearances of Jesus, even between them, because in Corinthians Paul tells us what he's heard, and he knows that Jesus appeared to his own brother, James. James, who became a leader of the church in Jerusalem. His life was changed. Paul also claims rather intriguingly that on one occasion Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at once. He's even bold enough to say, and most of them are still alive, you can go and talk to them if you don't believe what I'm telling you. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is very compelling. What other explanation is there, in fact, that makes any sense? That the tomb was empty and that so many people claimed to see him afterwards. When you go through all these accounts, the information that we're given carefully, there is no other explanation for what happened other than that Jesus did actually rise from the dead. And the most compelling evidence of all is the way that the people's lives were completely transformed. Especially the disciples who, before they saw Jesus alive again, were just completely broken people. Their dreams were shattered. Their hearts were full of fear in case what was going to happen to them was the same that had happened to Jesus. John says they were hiding behind locked doors for fear of the Jews. What else could have transformed them into people who were willing to give their lives for their belief in Jesus? Unless it was the resurrection. Most of them, we think, from accounts written down outside of the Bible, did give their lives. They became martyrs to the Christian faith. All except for John, interestingly, we think. Because even the fear of death had been overcome by the strength of their faith in their risen Lord. Those first believers were willing to risk everything for what they believed was true. They were totally convinced. And the great thing is that Jesus has gone on transforming people's lives ever since, and in no less remarkable ways. It was some time after the ascension of Jesus that Paul had his dramatic Damascus Road incident that I was going through earlier on. You can't really imagine a more dramatic turnaround in a person's life, can you? Doesn't matter what the barriers there seem to be between a particular individual and faith in Jesus, between a particular individual and a fuller life in Jesus. Whether it's grief or disappointment or fear or unbelief or ignorance or even outright opposition, no matter what, Jesus can find a way through. If there is just the slightest glimmer of an opportunity, the slightest opening of the door of somebody's heart. So if any of you are sitting here this morning not sure if Jesus is real and alive or not, then ask him to reveal himself to you. Test him out on that, because I believe that if you genuinely are open to that possibility, then he will make himself known to you somehow. Or if you're sceptical that Jesus can make an impact on somebody else's life that you know, someone maybe you would love to have either a first encounter with Jesus or a new encounter with Jesus, then don't stop praying for it to happen. Because Jesus can do what we can't imagine can happen in someone else's life. So that's really the first thing I want you to take to heart from my sermons anyway in this 40 days of Jesus period. The fact that the risen Jesus can transform people's lives. He began doing that within minutes of rising from the dead, and he has been doing it ever since. He is still doing it today.